Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started with our afternoon session. My name is Graham Campbell. I work on revenue and tax issues over at JFO, and I'm here to introduce Tom Kavet. How do I turn? Do I just speak louder?
Speak louder.
I guess I just have to speak louder then. My name's Graham Campbell. I work at JFO working on revenue and tax issues for the Legislature, and I'm here to introduce Tom Kavet, president of Kavet Rockler Associates, and he's going to give us an update on the economic conditions in Vermont and revenues. So without much further ado, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Graham. So I don't know if any of you have been seeing these signs out and about. It's my latest economic indicator for the state. In 25 years or so of doing this, I've not seen yard signs with hiring notices like I've been seeing of late. This one's on a back road near Graniteville. Oops. Now you don't see anything. Right. Okay, turn them way down. Yeah, but a sign of the times and sign of labor markets. I just want to review some of what's happening with revenues to date, so you have some idea of where things are going into the legislative session. And basically, revenues have been uneventful, which is good, very close to expectations. You can see here, the general fund, and this excludes a lot of the healthcare stuff that was just thrown into it because that's not typically what, you think about in terms of budgeting with respect to the general fund, is up slightly, about 1.3%. Transportation fund is just pretty much right on, and the education fund is just a fuzz over, but that's very close. There's a little bit of an anomaly with November revenues just because the month ended on a holiday and there was not processing on the last few days. So there's a little bit of slop that went into December. And the transportation fund money, we know what that was and made adjustments to it. The general fund money looks like it was about $3 million or so. I just got that number late last night, so in here we were estimating it was about 4. But anyway, it doesn't really change the material picture. But all three funds are looking very close to target. The major consumption taxes are all pretty closely aligned. The start of the holiday shopping season appears to be off to a good start. Some of the early numbers on that showed revenue gains of more than 15%. And so a good part of that has been online sales. So the fact that we're now taxing e-commerce and have revenue from e-commerce vendors has been very important to revenues. Most of the transportation fund categories are pretty close. There are a few offsets with some of the fee categories. And the strongest area of the general fund is personal income tax revenues. They're up maybe 2 to 3% above targets. But with all the tax changes that occurred last year with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, there are redistributions of income and timing that have complicated estimates. So I don't think this would, at this point, we're seeing huge changes in what we would expect by the end of the fiscal year. So revenue's pretty much on track. The economic expansion has been going on for a long time. 109 consecutive months, got 22.2 million new jobs. Job growth has been a little bit slower here towards the end, but job growth between 125,000 and 150,000 a month is enough to keep the national unemployment rate at about where it is, 3.6%. So some slowing here, but still a long, long run of positive job growth, positive GSP growth as well. So this is a chart with every economic recovery since 1947, and here's the one we're on right now. So this is the longest ever in the United States, but it's there's some questions now about just how long it can last. One of the reasons it may last a little bit longer is that it hasn't been as steep growth trajectory as in the past. And so that's really the big question, is just, when might there be a recession? And if there's a recession, what might it look like in terms of budgets and impact on revenue? Total U.S. GSP growth has slowed down from about 3% to 2%, and the fourth quarter is not looking very good. The Federal Reserve's projections for 2020 are at about 2%, so slower growth, but not a decline forecast. The risks of recession, as expressed by a survey the Wall Street Journal does of 75 economists, has shown a pretty dramatic increase since some of the trade war issues have been heating up. And they now have recession risks up at about a third. So that still means that about 2/3 of the economists surveyed don't see a recession in the next year. This is a 12-month window. 100% of them had a recession sometime before 2025, though, which I thought was also interesting, because I'm just going to go forward a couple. Because if you look at economic expansions in the United States, this is the longest one we've had, but there's nothing that says that just because an expansion's lasted a long time, that it has to end. And if we look at some other countries, Australia's had 112 quarters of expansion compared to where we are right now at 41. South Korea is still on a string. There have been a couple of single quarter declines, but this definition is 2 quarters of decline. That's not strictly the way U.S. recessions are timed. The National Bureau of Economic Research does the official dating of business cycles in the United States, and it's not identical to that. But this is an approximation. And Poland is also still running at 73 quarters. So, People's Republic of China is not on here because some of the early data are not reliable, but it's very likely, and these are more developed economies, but it's quite likely that that's an even longer run. And part of Australia's strength has been demand from China, especially through the last recession that occurred. But there's no reason that the recovery has to die just because of its tenure. But there's growing concern amidst the imbalances that may exist that could cause that. So that's what we're really looking at, is for things that are imbalanced. And I'll talk about some of the specific things at some point. One indicator that's a very reliable indicator of economic cycles is what's called the yield curve, and it's a ratio of long-term, short-term interest rates. So when long-term interest rates are lower than short-term interest rates, that creates an inverted yield curve. And as you can see, when that drops down below, it inverts, it drops down below zero. The gray bars are recessionary periods. This goes back to 1962. So it's not perfect, but every time it's dropped down, there's been a recessionary period, and it's dropped down here. Actually, you can't see this on the chart. It just, if the chart were slid over a little bit more, it would show it's gone back up above the zero line. In the handout, you'll see that it's come back up, so take a look at that. So some people have been saying, oh, great, the yield curve is now back in positive territory. But if you notice, it's not when it's down there that the recessions happen. It's after it's been down there. So just the fact that it's popped back up like to about here, which I think you'll see in the handout, doesn't mean that it's, oh, threat's over. That's still better news than if it stayed down there, but it remains to be seen whether this is going to be a false negative in the case of this because it's below zero or not. But anyway, there are a lot of indicators like that we're looking at to try to determine whether and what the imbalances are that could precipitate a recession. And right now, there's nothing that has the kind of imbalance that, say, the housing market did in 2007, 2008, as it was building up towards the recession that occurred. So we tend to think and remember the things that are most recent. So when we say recession, we think the last recession, and that was horrendous. That was the worst downturn since the Great Depression. But from what we're looking at now, if there were to be a downturn, it would not be as severe as the last one. And we're looking at a lot of different things that may be out of whack, corporate debt, equity prices, things like that could swing pretty hard on the downside, but maybe not with the same exposure that we had before. A couple of the lines that really make a difference, that really matter. Interest rates set by the Federal Reserve, and had the Federal Reserve, you'll see back here, so this is 2015, when they started raising interest rates step by step by step by step. The plan was to keep going up. And, based on what was being discussed in late 2017, the expectation was this was going to rise in a steady fashion and just sort of get back to more normal rates. If we look at this same chart over a long period of time, whoops, back up here. So this is back to 1954. This is the part of the chart that you're seeing. And so you can see how much higher rates generally are. This is a very unusual period to have interest rates that low for that long. Whoops, wrong way again. Here we go. So this interest rate increase here had a really pronounced impact on housing in particular. We saw housing price increases slow, existing home sales slow, new construction of housing slow, and it really started to impact the economy. Along with what was happening in the trade sector with trade wars, had that kept going up, we might very well be in recession right now. But instead, there's been a series of quick drops in interest rates, and that has had the exact opposite effect. Housing prices are again picking up. We're seeing a lot more existing home sales. We're seeing other credit-sensitive sectors doing better. And so that's been something of a lifeline. And the Fed seems very sensitive to present economic conditions. And even though I don't think there's going to be a rate cut in the next couple of weeks, it's I think if needed, they would still lower it. The concern is they don't have a lot of room to lower it. It's, you're so close to zero that, you're running out of stimulus on the monetary side. So, important things that we're watching. One of the things that's really holding up the economy right now is consumer spending. If consumer spending had not been as robust as it had been, that's another thing that would tip the economy into recession, and that's something we're looking at closely. As I said, the initial 5-day shopping period that we had looked very strong, just the last 5 days. But and a big chunk of our sales and use tax revenue come in this season. But this is a critical metric, and also very much coincides with recessionary periods. So this is the year-over-year change in inflation-adjusted retail sales. It's national level data, but our state data move in a very similar way. And you can see every time that's dropped significantly below and stayed there, there's been a recession. And we had an observation here that's a little below the line, but it didn't last long. That was earlier in the year. Again, connected to some of the interest rate increases that we had. And that's now popped back up. It's not quite at 2% real, but that's enough that it's, on a nominal basis, 3.5%. And that's that's enough to keep things humming. 70% of the economy is there. But what happens to consumers is going to be really important to watch, and a lot of that is psychological. So one of the big changes we've seen is this shift to e-commerce, and the e-commerce share of total U.S. retail sales is now approaching 12%. There are some parts of retail that it's a much bigger share of, because total retail sales includes things like automobile purchases and stuff like that, which is not as much online as some of the others. But if we look at some of the big categories, general merchandise is a big piece of total retail sales, and for the first time, online and other non-store, that would include catalog sales and stuff like that, actually exceeded general merchandise sales. It's not saying those are just online for general merchandise. It's as a total category, total online became larger than general merchandise. Each of those are about 11 or 12% of the total. But as a category, it gives you an order of magnitude. It's big, and it's growing very, very quickly. And the fact that that's now a part of the sales and use tax is really important. This is consumer sentiment, and it remains at pretty high levels. Again, it's been dinged by some of the trade war stuff, and that could unravel pretty quickly. The other thing that's really interesting about consumer sentiment, for the first time, there's a big gap, and the University of Michigan survey doesn't break it out like this, but the Conference Board, which also does a consumer sentiment survey, has one by party affiliation. And just to show the bubbles that can form around such things, those that are Republican are way more optimistic than those that are Democratic, and the independents tend to be very close to just halfway in between that. So there's a big difference by party affiliation on what the expectations are, both for an assessment of even current conditions, but even more importantly, future conditions. So just given that the psychology matters, even the fact that information flows so much more quickly between what's happening and how people perceive it, that also could speed up any bad news that might develop on this front. So anyway, so one of the things that's really been pumping up the economy has been the huge tax cut that occurred, and the fact that it was paid for with borrowed money. So, it was not financed. So, and the tax receipts, as everybody who was credible was projecting, were not positive. So it didn't end up paying for itself, and it's not likely to over any period of time. But if you look over time, and this is the annual deficit. So we're right now at about $1 trillion. There are times that deficit spending makes sense. During a recession, it's critical and is the proper economic policy response to a recession. But then in periods of expansion, like here, it should either go positive or, like here, get a lot closer to zero, such that there's capacity if there's another recession. So here's when you might have expected this would be going up in here, and instead it's going the other direction. And that creates a problem. I was talking about this as a policy tool. This is a chart that shows, those gray bars that I had on that yield curve, that's when there were recessions. This is every recession back to 1854. And so the yellow spaces are periods of economic expansion, and the gray bars are periods of contraction or recession. And right about in the middle of this chart is the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, these economic policy that used countercyclical spending, first through the Second World War, which wasn't so intentional, but after that as a regular policy feature, And you can see, since the Great Depression, how much more space is yellow than was the case back here, and also how much less space was gray in terms of contraction. And that's what, that's what prudent fiscal policy tries to do. But we're right now spending at a time when normally there would be a reduction in the deficit, and it's expanding instead. And this is what the CBO is projecting in terms of debt as a share of GDP. So this isn't just some level. This is debt as a share of GDP. So that's where they're saying it's headed, and we're in here right now. So that's a longer-term concern. It's not weighing on interest rates right now. It's not being transmitted. It's sort of the fiscal climate change type issue. It's huge and it's out there. But if you don't do something right away, you don't notice it in the moment. But when it comes, if you haven't done anything about it, it could be catastrophic. Here's another one of my signs. So I like seeing these things around. Reflecting a labor market, of course, that is very tight. The unemployment rate in Vermont is 2.2%. It's the lowest in the nation, and just a little bit up from its all-time low at 2.1%, which it was at from May through August. Also best in the nation. If you look at total unemployment relative to the U.S., that's where we're at right now, and doesn't get a lot lower. An interesting thing, there's some county unemployment rate data. They always look at county level data as a 12-month total because the Labor Department doesn't bother to seasonally adjust every single county. But we're going to be running some seasonal adjustment programs on the Vermont county, so we'll have timely data on that. But it looks like from some early runs that we're seeing big drops throughout the state. It's not, it's not this situation that we sometimes get where everything's just in Burlington. This is just in terms of unemployment rate, not employment growth, population growth, home prices, anything. There are lots of other metrics that are very, very skewed in favor of the Burlington metro area. But unemployment rates have been dropping throughout the state and are very, very low in almost every county. And I hope in a month or two we'll have some of the seasonally adjusted data that are more timely. But that's an interesting feature in terms of what's happening. Unemployment insurance claims hit record lows. I think there's a couple observations there that on your handout you'll see. I'm not sure why this slide thing is truncated, but anyway, maybe I'm not giving it enough space on that side. But those are record lows, and there have been some announced layoffs. The unit at Global Foundries that was just sold laid off 78 people, and there are a couple other announcements. But this is starting from a very low point. So that usually is a leading indicator of labor markets, and that right now is looking very good. If we go up to 2012, you can see how much redder the picture was than it is today, even at a county level throughout the nation. So improvement all across the board. One of the things that we haven't seen is a lot of wage growth. So if the market's really tight, historically you'd be seeing more wage growth than we're getting. We've been seeing about 3% wage growth, and it's kind of flatlined at about 3%, which with inflation at 1.5% to 2%, is not a lot of kick, relative to record low unemployment rates. And part of it is reflected in this job quality index that the Wall Street Journal ran recently. It's an academic venture that is measuring job quality by looking at pay relative to median wages. And there are just a lot more jobs that are lower quality service jobs with fewer hours than what had previously been manufacturing jobs with much higher pay and better hours. So job quality is still low, and the sign that I thought, the yard sign that I found most interesting and compelling was one that actually put some money on it and said, all right, not only do we have a job available, but here's a $7,500 hiring bonus. I think it's important to note when you hear talk about there being a shortage of workers, there's only a shortage of workers at a particular clearing price. So there's no such thing as a shortage of workers. If you want more workers, all you have to do is pay more, and you will have as many workers. If you put say there's a shortage of nurses and you need more nurses, if you paid $100,000 for a nursing position, you'd have a long line of people lined up to get a job. So what hasn't happened is that bidding hasn't really been very active. And so it's not translated into wage gains. And part of that is the relative power that employers have compared to workers. And with much lower unionization levels and things like that, there's not the same collective pressure that exists. We're seeing more and more people leaving jobs, but in a lot of cases, people getting hired new are getting higher wages than some of the people that are already employed at firms because there's not the same clamor, and especially going through a recession like we just did, a lot of people are just grateful to have a job. So the wage side of it has not really kicked in a lot. We're getting some real gains, but nothing like we might have had with unemployment rates like they are if it had been 40, 50 years ago. I just want to take a look at real estate markets quickly because that was sort of the epicenter of the last recession, and it also has a lot of implications with respect to migratory flows as well. So typically real estate markets are very, very regional. You know, this last downturn was an extraordinary exception where every single state lost home price value except for one, was North Dakota. It was in the middle of a energy boom, and also has a state bank that resisted some of the vagaries that other banks were dealing with. But that was unusual. Normally, there's one part of the country that's doing work, or even by certain metro areas that can get overbuilt. And it's because you can't really move buildings around. Where there's excess supply in one place and excess demand in another, the buildings don't move. And typically, that's not enough to just pull people in to fill them. So you'll get regional variation in that. This is a really unusual market situation. Now we're seeing with the recovery a whole lot of unevenness. So you have mountain states that are just booming. You know, prices are through the roof. Urban areas where big price increases. A lot of rural areas that have had much slower growth, including outside of the Burlington metropolitan area in Vermont. Every state except for 7 now are above their prior cyclical peak prices. So it means that if you're selling a house today, it's worth more than it's ever been before. And so the idea, if you thought it was worth a certain amount in 2007 or 2008, you're actually getting that price. So the states that are still below their prior cyclical peaks, notably, one of them is Connecticut. And we get a lot of both migration and second home purchases from Connecticut residents. And notably, I'll show you in a second the slide on the county differential, but the counties with higher second home ownership with Connecticut ownership are doing the worst in Vermont. So what happens in other states can affect us. This is a chart that I show on a regular basis, and the pink bars on these are the change in home prices since the last cyclical peak. So every state that's above to the right of this line here, has a pink bar to the right of the line, has improved since the last cyclical peak. And those down at the bottom here have not. See, Connecticut is still almost 12% below its prior cyclical peak prices. It's the worst in the nation. When Massachusetts, however, which is the best in New England, started to significantly grow above prior peak levels, it had an impact in that people could sell their homes. And if you're thinking about moving to Vermont or anywhere else, first of all, you could sell it and not realize a loss on it that you would have had if you had sold it earlier than this occurred. And the frozen real estate markets really affected migratory flows. It froze migration in the same way, and our population growth depends on migratory flows. So the thawing of the real estate markets is really important to the state because of that. If we look at total population change, it's only recently here that we've had a couple years where it's been positive, and that's the reason. We will have in a couple weeks 2019 data, so that'll be interesting to see. But it's close to zero, but it's just been positive. Just backing up, this is in the last quarter for the first time. The parts of the state outside of the Burlington MSA actually now are 2.2% above the prior cyclical peak, which is back here. Burlington is almost 20% higher. So just, you see how they went up in tandem in this is going all the way back to 1996, and then this yawning gap. That's occurred in a lot of states when you look at rural and urban patterns of this recovery. But anyway, it's notable that is positive. When we look at it by county, here are these counties, the worst counties. Typically the Northeast Kingdom, for almost any metric you're looking at, is the worst part of the state. Not so with real estate right now. So Bennington is the worst off here, and you do have more Connecticut-related ownership with second homes there, but it's been much slower in recovering. Now, this is a little bit older. This is 2018, so they don't release this with the same timeliness, the data that we have at the state level. So everything's moving in the right direction, but it just shows how far some parts of the state still have to go before they get back to where they were before the recession. Let's see if there's anything else on that. Oh. Yeah, this is just showing the Massachusetts and Vermont relative price changes. So that's, so this is a total year-over-year home price change. Whoops. This is like fat fingers on this here. So this is basically the real estate cycle in Vermont, and it's also the tax base for the property tax, which is most of the education fund revenue. So that's why this is really important to track and pay attention to. You'll see this is year-over-year percent change. So this is like 16% year-over-year percent change on home prices back in late 1980s, heading into then a deep recession in real estate in New England. It wasn't all over the country in the early 90s. And then the last big buildup and the crash after this. What's important to note is that these don't follow regular economic cycles. The real estate cycle is a much longer cycle, and it's much more varied by region. So this is the crash, and now we're coming out of it, and there's our last reading. And so we're getting a lot more appreciation in existing homes, even though it's uneven in the way it flows across the state. So the biggest risk to the economic expansion is clearly the trade wars, and it's very difficult to know where we're at any point in time with some of this. A lot of it's been conducted by tweet, and so far, it's lowered exports and imports, but not created more domestic production, to wit the steel and aluminum industries, which have not been investing in new capacity, have not been hiring, and yet all the downstream industries that depend on steel and metal and various things like that are at a competitive disadvantage because other countries don't have these same tariffs, and there are a lot more jobs in those downstream businesses than the basic manufacturing that occurs. So I'll go through a couple of charts that are of interest. So this is the balance of payments for goods and services. So not just goods, sometimes that's what's talked about. The United States has a surplus with services and a big deficit with goods. And you can see the role that China plays. It's big. And also you can see some of the other major trading partners. That's Japan, purple. Mexico is the gray. The European Union is green. And OPEC countries are red. And then all other countries are this kind of blue. So what's interesting is this is one way to sort of look at the total decomposed. But when you break this up into the line charts, it's really interesting. You have three main things that I think are really notable about this. These are the same regional groupings that were in the other chart. And so you see China, getting bigger and bigger down here. But there was a pronounced change in here in OPEC and other countries, and a lot of this was energy related. All of the OPEC was energy related, so this red line going up into surplus, but much of the other country change had to do with energy exports. So as the United States became more self-sufficient and entirely self-sufficient by here in energy, we weren't importing. So had we not done that, our total balance of trade would be phenomenally worse. But that's a major shift. And the second big thing, of course, is China's huge role. But what's interesting is here as China's come up, and that's just recent actions. So there's been a dramatic reduction in imports, but there's also been a reduction in exports, so that it hasn't changed a whole lot. And what's happened is that those imports, the reduced imports from China, haven't translated into jobs in the United States. It's translated into more imports from other countries. So other countries have gone up. Here's like all other countries here. All these are, greater trade deficit, and China goes the other direction. But it's not really having its intended effects. And this is also missing a really critical bar there, but it goes up above $80 billion on annualized rate. This is the tax burden on this, and there was just a paper about 5 days ago from the New York Fed that was estimating the extent to which China's really paying for the tariffs versus U.S. consumers and importers. And their conclusion was that virtually all of this $80 billion is being paid by American companies and consumers. So China would have had to lower its prices by about 20% to have that be a pass-through. They've lowered them by 2%, and the rest of it's been picked up by American consumers. So that's a tax that, this used to be the way the federal government got all its money. Before about 1920, tariffs were the main source of revenue for the federal government. Not anymore, but that used to be the main source of revenue that the nation had. But it's a very big swing, and it operates just like a tax. It's just spread through the economy. The dollar has also strengthened, so that's something else that deters exports, U.S. exports. And in this latest round with Argentina and Brazil, they were accused of currency manipulation. They actually Argentina had been trying to prop up its currency, not to devalue it, and they were blamed as being currency manipulators. The lack of understanding of the basic economics of how international trade works is staggering. But you're just not acting on facts and an understanding of how these markets work. So tariffs are being used almost, certainly in a capricious way, but almost a random way as just something that's lashed out. So Brazil was selling China soybeans, let's put tariffs on Brazil, you know, and then not agricultural tariffs, but steel tariffs. Anyway, that's what's happening. Yeah. So so the bottom line here with respect to Vermont is, you know, exports are down. A lot of our exports are in the electronic area. But fun fact, we'll get around to what's export. Does anybody want to venture a guess on what state in the United States has the highest share of the population age 18 to 21? So 18, what?
Utah, Colorado.
Utah, Colorado, Washington, Texas. Who said that? You're right. It's Vermont. So this is interesting. So Utah has, highest share of children by far. Percentage of population of young children, it's high. Also, the highest fertility rate, although there's some Midwestern states that are close. Vermont has the lowest fertility rates in the nation, but the highest share of 18 to 21-year-olds and 18 to 22-year-olds because we export higher educational services, and we get college students who come into the state and buy this product, educational services, and we have a relatively small population relative to the number of colleges, even though there have been some closures that are notable. But this is an export industry, just like tourism is an export that the state has that's not counted in the same way as a lot of these other tourism stats. But we are exporting that as a service, and the fact that enrollments from international students are declining, in part because of general negative sentiment about the United States in foreign countries, that can also impact us. I don't have good stats on it, but that's an important part of the economy that you don't think of as being export-related and affected by international trade, but it is. It also is part of, you know, people say, oh, we're losing all our young people. Well, you're going to show at the end of the 4 years of college, you're going to have a lot of people leaving just because they graduated from college, and they're not necessarily staying, but they're not long-time Vermont residents either. So anyway, that's just important mix in there. So forecast risks. We'll have a few minutes for questions. This is a chart that we did back in July with no arrows. So the chart in July had no arrows, so it's just showing where we thought these various risks were. And the escalation of the trade wars back then was a big one. That's still the highest risk. So the red arrows show roughly, if we were to do it again today, where the movement would be. And so there's been more talk and concern and chatter with the trade wars. Corporate debt also, low-grade corporate debt is really a concern. Stock market's gone up even further, which makes a correction more problematic. And inventory buildups are also a real concern because you get high levels of inventory, then production gets cut back. Already, manufacturing, agriculture, and transportation and goods movement that support agriculture and manufacturing largely are all in contraction in the United States. So those sectors are about a fifth of the economy. They're already in negative territory. So a bigger inventory correction would weigh even more heavily on manufacturing, which is already in recession and is a concern. Fed policy has been really positive, so it would be a lower risk thing. Labor market overheating, doesn't look like that's happening. Same with sudden increase in inflation. We're not getting any wage pressure. So anyway, big risk is the trade wars. No reason that there has to be a recession next year, but the risks of it are rising with this. So that's general picture. And one more sign. This one's for the census. So lots of jobs out there, not always high paying. Any what? But essential. Absolutely. Yeah. Questions? Oh, you want to do it? Yeah.
Thank you. So last year, I have a two-part question. Last year at this briefing, I think you told us that if Vermont wanted to solve some of our demographic issues and tax-based issues, a great strategy would be to welcome and resettle more refugees in our state. Do you remember saying that?
I certainly
So
could
my
have.
first question is, can you just say that again?
Consider it said. The problem is that we don't control immigration policy. So that's, so it's kind of, this. I mean, at a federal level, you could do that. You would, you could have any number of people come in you want.
And I know that our refugee resettlement program has seen declines, and that I don't know the exact numbers, but has seen declines. And I'm just wondering if there's been any economic analysis around the impact of sort of that trajectory.
It's uniformly negative. I mean,
Yeah.
immigration is a plus in terms of economic models that we're using. So if you reduce that, and it's been sharply curtailed, and particularly with refugees. I mean, it was I think there was a month where there was 0, and it's the first time in memory that it was actually 0 for 1 month. So, that's not helping it. But that's all at the federal level, and there's just very little leverage or anything that can be done at a state level that changes that. Yeah.
So we see an impact on our agricultural sector as a result of these tariffs. And then the federal government comes in and they pump money into the agricultural sector as a result of this loss in international trade. What's the wash on that? How does that sugar off in the end?
So the money that they're paying is largely borrowed money. So there's one of the cartoons, showed that I had last time, I think, showed a farmer saying, we can't sell to China now, so we're borrowing money from China to pay me, to compensate me for that lost business. And that is essentially what's happening. So, it at least keeps that sector a little more afloat, but it has been tilted towards larger agricultural enterprises for the most part. So smaller farmers have had a harder time jumping through all the hoops to get the money. And then there's some parts of ag that are also depressed for non-trade related reasons, and dairy is one of those. So in terms of local impacts. But yeah, so it's been an offset to some extent. It works like stimulus money, like it's a direct government transfer. But again, it's not being paid for with new taxes. It's deficit spending.
Related to your help wanted signs,
Yeah.
I can't help but wonder, we talk about being the lowest unemployment rate in the country. How much of that is impacting our economy, and is it risk leading to a recession if employers can't find enough employees? In other words, they don't expand here, they move elsewhere where there's perhaps a more able labor market. And along the same line, nationally, a lot of places are having the same problem. Is that a real risk of a recession if we can't figure out a way to change the demographic, whether it's through refugees or whether it's through other types of programs facing us?
Yeah, that's a good question. But people don't usually move. I mean, a lot of reasons people move, but labor is, in a normal real estate environment, is highly mobile within the United States. I mean, it's very easy to move. And if you can sell a house without too much trouble and without a great loss, and this is the largest asset that most households have. So their primary residence is where most of their personal wealth is lodged. So the idea of, all right, do I want to sell that at a price that's less than it was worth 10 years ago and take that loss in order to have a job, or just stay where I am and kind of hope things will be better? It's not until those prices get up to where you say, I mean, you're getting some of this calculus now with people in Massachusetts. I can sell my house for $500,000, and in Vermont, for $350,000, I can buy a comparable house and have $150,000 left over. That's like a hiring bonus. And that typically is how we've gotten in migration. And so it's not a question of, oh, there are people sort of captive here. If they're jobs with pay and there's a capacity to sell houses, which, you know, that's been healing generally. New England was slow to heal, and that's where we get most of our net in migration. Massachusetts and Connecticut's big. There are other states, but Massachusetts is the biggest one. That's more important than saying, well, how many people can we get here? So people come in to the state when there are jobs that are good jobs that are being offered and they can sell their houses. And that will be happening. Wages are going up, and compared to a lot of urban areas, prices here are still fairly low on the housing side. So I think it's the job side that's pushing it, but the low unemployment rate will not be precipitating a recession. It's really just a question of real estate markets thawing, and then job offerings being at a sufficient wage to really attract people to move. Yeah, okay, a couple more.
What you're describing, how is this impacting the people who are earning minimum wage here in Vermont? Are there less people now earning minimum wage as it currently exists, or is the market adjusting this, or can you track that yet?
It's probably a little bit too early to know, because our data on the wage breaks comes from the Occupational Employment Survey, which is a lag, so it's not real timely. But from what we know and hear anecdotally from employers, it's just very hard to find people at the minimum wage, and you see that where we see this is like in New Hampshire. So the minimum wage there is $7.50, and what? $7.25. What is it? It's the national minimum wage.
Yeah.
$7.25. Okay. So we did some runs looking at the, yeah, right. Thanks for the correction. We did some runs when we did one of the last minimum wage analyses to look at the distribution of wages in New Hampshire. There are very few jobs that are below the Vermont minimum wage in New Hampshire, because the prevailing market wage is a lot higher. And so that was interesting. And then when we looked at the characteristics of those people that were accepting those wages, it was highly skewed towards female workers, older workers, some sectors. So the retail sector, for example, the brick and mortar store sector, which interestingly is, the e-commerce thing is impacting New Hampshire much more severely than Vermont, because we have fewer brick and mortar stores, the big box kind of stores, especially along the border. But I think it's fair to say that with the economy doing better, it's affecting the low end, the very low end. You're still not getting manufacturing quality as many of those kind of jobs. But it's definitely affecting things at the bottom too. What's interesting is how elastic the labor force is, though. As wages do start to go up, you pull in people that weren't employed. So we're seeing this with older workers who are working longer, but you can, their health is generally better, and you can have workers staying in the labor force or deciding to come back in the labor force if it's worth if there's enough money to do it. Because our population, our working age population, has been declining, and we've had employment growth in the last year and last several years. Yeah. One more, or are you done? Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'd be happy to take questions afterwards, too. Thank you.
The budget context, and a lot of these slides you've seen before each year. This is the FY20 appropriations as passed, and what we do is we have a $6.1 billion all funds budget, and you can see from this $2 billion is federal funds. The general fund is 1.6, slightly less than past years because we dedicated the sales tax to the education fund, and so you'll see the education fund at around the same 1.7, 28%. And you can see the sales tax revenue at the $585 million. Special funds and transportation fund are smaller wedges there. One of the issues you're going to hear about probably during the session is the ability of the transportation fund to meet needs, and it's an increasing problem. I'm hearing that I should push it closer to my mouth so you can hear. Yeah. The transportation fund is an increasing issue, with part of the receipts being the gas tax, and we're going to have to figure out what makes sense to keep that meeting our needs. Where does the money go? Again, this is a different portrayal of the chart that you've seen before. You can see the big players here are K through 12 education and Medicaid. Medicaid's an interesting case because the last few years we've actually had very little growth in Medicaid compared to where we would have in times of maybe a recession. So this is one that we've had the good years, and as Tom said, we don't know what the future brings, but we're not predicting for FY21 a major uptick in Medicaid. But it's still a big player, and so a little change in the cost of health care can have a huge impact. This is looking at it, not the 6.1, but the state funds only. And on this chart, you start seeing the beginnings of corrections. Corrections gets virtually no federal funds showing up there. But again, you still see the K through 12 education and Medicaid being the big players. And then we have one more on this type of chart where we look at just the general fund and other state funds without the property tax. And again, you see the Medicaid. But you also start seeing corrections come up as a larger share of the total. And as we've said before, this is a real problem from the point of view of just when we talk about the budget. 6.1 billion is the whole budget. The part we mostly control is the general fund, the 1.6 billion, and yet the general fund makes up for things where we lose money. Like, for example, if the federal government, the federal Medicaid match rate drops, the general fund will be the source of the money to pick it up. So it's a smaller chunk, but it gets impacted by everything that happens around it. So again, on the general fund, the big chunks of the general fund, teachers' retirement, OPEB continues to be a fast-growing sort of big chunk, and it's scheduled to continue growing. We're actually starting to see this year, and one of the later slides will point that out, a little bit of an improvement on the funded ratios because we're in a process of between now and 2038 of paying our unfunded liabilities. But it's going to be a fairly steep effort to try to ensure that we pay those down. Medicaid is still a big part. You see the corrections, children and family and higher ed. I remember a number of years ago, higher ed and corrections were, higher ed was a larger number. Corrections is now past it and substantially. Just as our growth rates, our overall fund growth rate, you can see 2.43% from FY15. It's pretty reasonable, and that's, you can see a slightly higher growth rate in the general fund, 3.2%. Again, that's that characteristic of the general fund has to make up expenses where other things aren't covering. These have been fairly good years, and I think that the Medicaid continues to be an area we need to watch for if there was a downturn, the demands on the system would be fairly strong, and so that becomes an issue. Federal funds, we're in this weird position that Tom talked about, where we're living in deficits. The federal government keeps spending, and there isn't a lot of money. The area where the reductions would come would probably be in state and local grants. So it's how that all unfurls and how it all is impacted is going to be an issue. But as of yet, for this year, we don't anticipate major downturns in the federal funds. Tax expenditures, I just wanted to make sure to have a slide on that where you can see $829 million of tax expenditures. It's gone up from last year, about $40 million. And the reason it's gone up is just because of a change in our tax law, that we now have a separate tax on, in the past we were coupled with taxable income, now we're coupled with adjusted gross income. So when we give people a deduction, it shows up as a Vermont tax expenditure as opposed to tying ourselves to a federal income. So part of the change is just a change in how we record, how we do our taxation. But it is big chunks, and it does have that characteristic that if we spend money by a tax expenditure, that is money that would otherwise come into the Treasury. And so we try to keep at least pointing out what is going out in those areas. Finally, this is a chart which we look at current service trends and spending and revenue. And so the blue line is revenue, and the green line is sort of up till FY20 is spending, and then beyond FY20 we used a growth rate of about 3.2%. And what this chart is designed to do is say, based on a projection of revenue, the blue line, and our projection of current service budget needs, what is that gap? What is the sort of difference between that? So what happens now with the administration is they are saying, okay, if we were to fund everything that we have on our plate, and not everything, because it doesn't fund child care, it doesn't fund other sort of liabilities that we have as a state, where would that, or for example, property transfer tax we use for the general fund, and if we were to go back to the formula, there would be more paid there. But what is that gap? And you can sort of see that 70 million. So what they're doing now in the budget process and the administration is trying to bring the current services spending line down to the available revenue. And so this chart, when you actually get the budgets in January, there will be no gap. What you'll see instead is decisions being made by the administration to try to bring those two in line. And there may be decisions that the legislature agrees with or doesn't agree with or makes changes to it. But it just gives you a sense of a pressure that we have every year that we have to address. Other liabilities, it's not retirement. You've actually done a lot of work lately to deal with the retirement pressure. It's still there. We've also set aside money to address some of our other deficits, but there are these sort of large special fund issues which I just want to reiterate, whether it's a transportation fund, whether it's public service department, whether it's revenue coming in from those types of sources. We're going to have to look at our special fund receipts and just whether they're sufficient to cover what the needs are. So that's going to be an area that you're going to hear about in a lot of committees. The retirement, you can just see where it's not a huge change, but you can start seeing the beginning of a turnaround where state employees on an actuarial value asset is pretty level. The teachers, we've just small, 55.2% actuarial value assets to 55.7% funded. And that's the ratio funded. What happened is we sort of assume when there's market value of assets is what the retirement fund is worth now. What the actuarial value says is in any one year there may be a slight down in income, there might be an up income, so it smooths out that value of assets over a 5-year period. So if you would have one bad year, that the sort of shortfall would be spread over 5 years. If you have a good year, the same thing. So the market value is a very current piece. It's more volatile. If we continue our funding plan that is in place, you should see every year that funded ratio in both of those start to improve. Again, reserves is the amazing bright spot. In the last few years, the legislature has been pretty active about putting excess money into reserves. And there's transportation fund reserve is full, the education fund reserve is full, and then in the general fund, we've created a stabilization reserve, which we've kept at 5%. We now have the rainy day fund growing to $32 million. We've created a human services caseload reserve at $100 million, and we put aside money for that 53rd week that, and 27th pay period. And what that is every 7 years, we have a 53rd week that we have to pay on Medicaid payments, and it just has the number of days as 365, and if you divide it by 7, there's an extra day, and every 7 years you have an extra week. And then on the 27th pay period, we have the same sort of phenomena happening every 14 years. And both of those happen together, and I think it's 2022. So we're putting aside money so it isn't a one-time hit on the general fund. But you add all those reserves up, it's about 14% of the general fund. And the sort of nationally, one thing about Vermont is we have a fairly volatile revenue system. So 11 to 14% is considered to be a pretty good reserve for a normal, cover us in case of a normal downturn. If we get to an extreme downturn like we had in 2010-11, the number is closer to 18%. So this building of reserve is an important piece. It could be, it's a good thing to have. It's not, we're clearly not totally protected, but it's better than we've been in years. Just the FY federal funds, I just wanted to, you can see where our federal funds go. Medicaid is our big part. Basically half of our federal funds go through Medicaid. Other human services, 300,000, and transportation, 300,000. So these are the areas where we would be most vulnerable to changes in what happens on the federal side. Federally, we just talked about this. The other mandatory programs, the domestic discretionary in FY 2008, it was 19% of the federal budget. Now it's 15% of the federal budget. It's sort of where you find the money to meet other needs. And so, again, if we do see it's hard to, and this category name value percentage, I guess those are, let me look at my chart. Anybody else has that chart out they can see? I guess when we put it on the screen. Does it show it up on your chart too? Okay. Stephanie, do you remember what those two are? Yeah, Social Security is the lowest chart, and then right above it is Medicare, would be those two. And you can sort of see where the federal dollar goes: national defense, Social Security, Medicare being more than half the budget. And then you get Medicaid and other mandatory. So you can see where the federal dollars have to go, where the room is for possible reductions. And so again, we're in election year, generally in election years, yeah.
Debt service on that chart?
On federal debt service, I think that would be on other mandatory, but no, it's not listed there.
Is that the dark purple?
I would think it is, but it's not listed on that one. It's a good question. I have to get back to you. And yeah, it is. But as far as a percentage of the whole budget, I don't have that. We'll try to get that and put it on our website in this document. Just on the other thing, I was on the federal grants per capita. You can see Vermont is up pretty close up to the top. So you can see the average is that yellow, the middle bar there. We're District of Columbia, Alaska, New Mexico, New York, Wyoming, and then Vermont. And part of that is because our Medicaid program is big, that we utilize a lot of federal dollars. But again, it gives you a sense of vulnerability if there are federal reductions. So it's
How important the census is.
what?
And how important the census is.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, this is an area where I'm trying to, I mean, up to now I've sort of like been more, I mean, this is a real anxiety. But the other hand is it doesn't, you keep looking at the numbers and say somebody has to start, you know, cutting on the federal side, and we should see that. But it just hasn't happened. Right. And this is, that should be in the other human services category that I think we had on this chart, you know, 327 million. But this is really only money coming in through the state budget. So to the extent that SNAP is a program that goes, does that go directly out to individuals? It won't show up in this chart.
Well, my question is, if the impact really is 23 million,
Yeah.
and the assumptions that I'm hearing is that's going to happen,
Yeah.
we are not going to let Vermonters charge. So, what's our time frame and risk with that?
And that's a really, I mean, this is a big issue that you're going to have to deal with. It's what do you do when a federal program cuts back a benefit that is not part of our budget? Do we create a separate program? Do you find a way to supplement it? Those are the types of issues you're going to be dealing with. And, you know, even this morning they were talking about further cuts to food stamps. And that's the type of issue that I don't have an answer for you. It's going to be something you'll have to address.
What's our time frame on that?
Well, first of all, from what I understood from this morning, they really haven't even put the regulations in place, and we don't know if Congress is going to act. We don't really know what's going to happen between now and the president sort of saying he'd like to make this happen or he wants to do it, and you know how much of it actually occurs. So I would say you're going to be here when the clarity, when we have more clarity, and I think we'll be. And we don't know. I mean, my hope is that there'll be some sort of, that some of it won't happen. But we've seen some cuts to food stamps and other programs. So there'll be things that are not even in this budget pie or world that you're going to be saying, I want to fund, let alone climate change issues. And so this is just the demands will be there. You'll find things that people want to spend money on. Okay, let me think if there's any, so that's pretty much it on the budget. Any other sort of questions? And I'm going to shift gears in about a minute here because I have a different role, which is to introduce the Legislative Management Committee. One of the things that's been going on, and you all probably have heard about parts of this, and the legislature in the fall of 2018 hired a National Conference of State Legislatures to look at salaries and look at the structure of staff, look at the organization and what's been happening. And during the 2019 session, you basically put in place a joint okay, I will try to talk directly into this mic and loudly here. Okay, so you put into place a joint legislative management committee, which has been meeting throughout the summer, primarily focusing on the structure of legislative staff and how to best design it to meet the legislative needs. And we're going to have the Senate President and the Speaker talk about the work of that committee. And they've asked me just to make a couple of contextual points before they start up the presentation. First is that the NCSL study pointed out we have a pretty strong staff in place. And so there's a real sense that we're building toward the future. We're trying to figure out a vision for the years ahead as opposed to correcting something that is not working. The other thing I just want to flag is the current legislative staff structure grew out of the 1970s, in a time when legislators, both in Congress and legislatures around the country, were strengthening their capacities. It was in Vermont, prior to that time, we had a fairly small legislative staff of Legislative Reference Bureau. We had people who were brought on in the session from part-time lawyers to help draft things, but there really wasn't an organized staff structure. And in so 1972 session, we created the Legislative Council. In '74, we created the separate Joint Fiscal Committee. And in that time was the same time as in Congress, they created the Congressional Budget Office, they created the Joint Committee on Taxation, and you'll see in other states like Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, for a few, created the same type of a joint fiscal committee. And there was this sort of major retaking of legislative power, both nationally and in the state. So what you're seeing here is really the first time since since then we've grown sort of, I would say, organically. We've added staff. We've had to deal with the increasing technology that legislatures use and providing those services. We've dealt with the changing issues of gender, just bias issues, dealing with gender bias, learning, and trying to deal with all the sort of issues come up in hiring and things like that. So there's been a lot of change. It's been 50 years since we've had a sort of review of this staff structure and figuring out what we need to do. So this is a good thing to look at. It's basically an important step. And then the other thing I just want to flag is the uniqueness of the Vermont legislature. We're unique in a number of respects that you all are very familiar with. Legislators here represent very small districts. You have no personal staff, no district staff, and nonpartisan staff play a critical support role. There's virtually no partisan staff except for the Speaker and Senate President, who have one person each. It's a legislature of distributed power. The committees do probably the bulk of the work, and because of that, with most legislative decision-making happening at the committee level, it's pretty staff-intensive. We work with committees. It also has varying times of work intensity, and so it's a combination of a very small staff, but also sort of intense pressure in a context where other legislatures can be more leadership-focused. And Massachusetts, years ago, when I worked there, that you'll find the committee hearings are not well attended. Their staff will sometimes show up, but it's different here. I mean, you basically are there in the committee rooms, you work it, and that's where the decisions are being made. On the fiscal side, we're one of 6 states in the country that has no line item veto. No line item veto. The states that have no line item veto are New Hampshire, North Carolina, Nevada, Rhode Island, and Michigan. 3 of them are Northeast states. And so the vision that the constitutional writers of these states have is a pretty strong legislature. We don't give the governor the right to sort of pick apart the budget. He has to make that choice to veto it or not as a whole. And many states have even more than just the ability to veto a line item. Looking at our neighboring states, the New York Constitution has language in it that says the legislature cannot add to an existing appropriation. If they want to add money to a line, they have to create a new line item. So while they have a line item veto, if you want to increase legal services funding, for example, it will be put in a separate line in the budget that could be vetoed with that line item veto power. The legislature can reduce money. And the way they word it is it has to be separate and distinct from the original items of the bill and refer to a single object or purpose in their constitution. In Massachusetts, the legislature has the authority to disapprove or reduce parts of not only line items, but parts of line items. So you can change a number, you can change language, and it allows sort of a fairly strong veto power on the part of the governor, and it makes the budget one where the legislature's ability to sort of use that as a pretty powerful document is diminished. Wisconsin creates probably the most gubernatorial flexibility, where they can veto individual digits. They can't create new words by taking letters from the existing words, but they are allowed to change sentences. It's a fairly dramatic power. So part of what you're dealing with when you deal with staff, and we deal with our structure, is this sort of legislative versus executive relationship. What is the level of power you want to have in the executive branch versus the legislative branch? And so all these issues come together in sort of how the deliberations go. So as you're hearing the report from the Speaker and Senate President, And as they're trying to design or working with a committee to design the future of staffing, it's important to understand that it affects, the committees, it affects the partisan, nonpartisan nature of our institution serving everybody. It depends on the sort of fundamental relationship between the branches and power. So that is my context. I think I will turn it over to the people that really matter here.
Well, I think Steve's queued up the changing nature of the workforce who work on our behalf and serve us either on the joint fiscal side, Ledge Council, and elsewhere. And we're now going to tell you a little bit about what you should expect in the coming months so that you're not surprised when we come back in January with proposals from what is now called the Joint Legislative Management Committee, which was created in the budget this past year. And I'll just cue it up by saying that for anyone who's served on the Legislative Council Committee over the years, and I don't know how many people here have, there's at any moment in time, there's 10 legislators, 5 House, 5 Senate. 4 and 4. And that committee, often unseen by the legislature, spends almost all its time working through staffing issues, personnel matters, salary questions, and so on. It operates truly almost like an HR function. The Joint Fiscal Committee has the exact same responsibility for the Joint Fiscal Office. Then all the other silos that are in the State House, each has its own way of handling kind of personnel matters and others. And when Mitzi and I both got to our current roles 3 years ago, what would often happen is where things were falling through the cracks or where there were real problems, people would just come to us. And sometimes that's appropriate. Other times it's basically dealing with what are very important matters of workplace conditions and practices for the people who work for us. And we're being put in a position to try to create policies which put everyone at more risk than is appropriate. We're trying to be fair and appropriate and address a situation in real time. But in terms of consistent practices across all of the state legislative workforce, we knew at that time very quickly that we were lacking. That the way someone at the Joint Fiscal Office or Ledge Council or working in the Secretary's office or the Clerk's office or Sergeant at Arms, if they had a problem, they were all being asked to turn to different people in their particular unit to decide what to do next. Whenever there were questions or unknowns, people tried to figure it out on their own, but that would create discrepancies between the working practices for one person versus someone who might work down the hall. So we created this committee to start looking to see if there was a way we could have an overarching workforce sort of policy that would serve all the people who work on our behalf for the legislature. And since we adjourned, we've been meeting periodically to try to figure out what things are appropriate to create a uniform policy for personnel matters across the legislative branch, and then a number of recommendations we'll be bringing forward. So let me turn it over to Mitzi to take it away.
All right. So quick history. From about 2015 to 2018, various issues started coming up. I was on the Appropriations Committee for some of that time, and issues would be raised about trying to get staff salaries up to something related to market rates as related to the executive branch, and raising committee assistant pay and that kind of thing. That then highlighted the differences between the one division that was advocating for pay increases and others that weren't, and really raised questions about how well we're treating our own staff and equity between our various divisions, as well as equity between branches of government. So we then funded this NCSL study. Their specific job was to look at relevant market comps for staff salaries, staff resources and capacity issues, but in the various divisions, the various offices, and the organizational and staffing structure of the whole legislature, for some of the reasons that Tim mentioned. And so NCSL came, engaged with staff and legislators They have done this in a number of different states, so we're also able to compare us to legislatures of similar size, with similar staffing size, with a similar dynamic that we have, and very informative. The final report was released, and the legislature established this committee. So we've been meeting. The purview of the committee is to provide general oversight and management across the offices of the General Assembly and administrative services to the legislative offices and the legislature. So okay, so our next steps, now that we've been doing this, is we made the drafting deadline. We've got some draft legislation in, and we're starting to develop the report that will come to all of us. Next week, you'll be getting a more formal email from the committee with all of this in better detail and some links to our committee page. We have a committee page just like every other committee out there. So you're welcome to check out the testimony and any documents there to get, to give you a heads up about this, but also to get your feedback about our kind of temporary proposal. And December 20th, we'll have a meeting. If you would like to come and testify, you are welcome. There'll be information on how to sign up. And over the 2020 session, this will be more formally presented as a bill, and will work its way for any statutory changes necessary through the normal legislative process. So, quick highlight. Again, you'll be getting more information, and we can go into detail later. But so before we get there, right? Yeah. Don't worry about that. Right now we have these 5 silos. Senate Secretary, House Clerk, Sergeant-at-Arms, Joint Fiscal, Leg Counsel, plus Tim's office, my office, and with no overarching authority, no referee or collaborator or anybody sort of taking a big look at all the legislature saying, how can we do this better? So I think don't worry about all the little details, you'll be able to read the words when this gets emailed to you. The most important thing that I think that we are doing, 2 most important things, are the overarching line above, so that there is an entity looking at the whole legislature, and that there's a restructuring here where we create a shared administrative services division, so that HR happens in one place, finance and administration happens in one place, and that becomes, sort of a more central entity that the others can rely on for some of that assistance. It's all stuff that happens now, but sometimes happens inconsistently or really not as well as we could be doing it because there isn't any one person in charge. And so I think you'll be able to see all this in detail when it comes to you. Tim?
Yeah, and one of the key pieces, when you do spend some more time, this box right in the middle, the shared administrative services, that's one of the most significant features, and something that we anticipated when we passed the language in the budget. Really making sure that we have one common place for human resources, support and policies and practices, the onboarding practices, not having each unit try to wing it in terms of payroll and bill pay, all that stuff, but have one entity which is providing services across the board. So in that sense, it does look like an organizational chart change that will be recommended, which it is, although we hope most of it will be invisible to the legislature, but just provide even better support to all the different entities. And everything here is intended to allow better, uniform, high-quality services across all of the different entities that Mitzi described before. You'll see that the information technology piece we want to make it really clear that's its own entity, which is providing the kind of IT support to every one of these green boxes that we see here, not something that is sort of artificially buttonholed into the Ledge Council office, but something that's serving everybody. So the committee that has been meeting to look at this has put in a lot of hours, and importantly has had numerous, and when I say numerous, I'd say probably 5 different hearings where we have very proactively reached out to staff at all levels to encourage them to come forward, give us their ideas about how changes could be made which would improve their work lives and the support they're able to offer us as legislators. We've had dozens of them come forward and put things in writing. We've surveyed the entire legislative staff, all the divisions, and that information has been taken in by the committee. So we felt very strongly that this is ultimately not only about how we are served by the staff, but improving the work lives of the people so that they want to stay, and that's really important to us. And so it's been really great to hear from them. And one of the things we do face, and one of the reasons why some of these changes we hope are important, we all know how vulnerable our small legislature is when someone leaves any one of these green boxes. We lose 1 or 2 people at IT, it can grind things to a halt. We lose 1 or 2 lawyers who serve specific committees, and it's a huge step back in terms of built-in knowledge, and so on down the line. Each of these units is really important. So we want to have the best working environment so that more people can see a longer trajectory for them working in the place that we all love here so much. So I'm not sure if it's appropriate to turn it over. We're not sure if people have questions in the meantime, and we're happy to field them as best we can, and leave it at that.
Yeah, and we're going to try not to go too deep in the weeds on all this, because you will be getting a lot more detail and there will be other opportunities. But anything on people's minds at the moment?
What's the recommended, like if you took this whole thing as it currently exists and then say what this new proposal is, what's the change in staff complement?
Right now, that's still up for discussion, but the maximum that we're talking about right now in the committee is 1, and that would be an HR specialist. This is really about taking the resources that we have and deploying them better. We are so incredibly fortunate to have such high-quality staff. NCSL commented on that multiple times to me. We really are grateful, and you'll be hearing more from me, at least House members will, about how we can make sure to treat them respectfully and welcome them civilly in all of our committees. And so this isn't about adding a lot of staff. It's about making sure that we work well with what we currently have. I think I'm heading into my 18th session, and in the time that I've been here, we've been able to maintain this incredibly high quality, dedicated staff, but I've seen some sort of calcification between the silos, and so it's my hope that this is helping us both professionalize certain administrative elements, but also reducing some of those silos and creating some interdependency between some of these offices so that things can flow a little more seamlessly between them, and shifting the culture back a little bit. Anything else? All right, well, you will be hearing more from us. I think we just wrapping it up. So thank you all very, very much for coming. We look forward to seeing you back in January, and have a very good and safe and fun holiday season. And before you go, one more round of applause, folks, for our staff, and in particular Teresa that pulled this all together.